Hello everybody, I'm here with another video, and to start it, let me tell you a story. So I'll be taking you back to the 1500s during the Protestant Reformation, and I want you to ask yourself if you've ever heard of this man, Ulrich Zwingli. If you haven't, he's one of the first generation Protestant reformers, along with Luther and some other guys. When he gained power and influence, he also gained followers and workmates. That's pretty basic, but the thing is, not all of the reformers and not all of his workmates wanted equal amounts of reformation. Two of his best-known associates were Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz, and these were radical reformers. These ones wanted more and more reformation. They didn't want any tithes, they didn't want ecclesiocracies, they didn't want any of that. They wanted more distinction from the Catholic Church, and Zwingli did not, so he sent these soon-to-be-called heretics away and basically told them to shut up. They did not shut up. Actually, they rebaptized each other during a secret meeting, and these men were the ones who started the Anabaptist movement. A few decades later, the Anabaptists were many in number, and as you might expect, the Catholics of the day didn't like them very much. 1533. An Anabaptist named Jan popped his head into the history of religion. In Europe, the Catholic Europeans didn't like Protestantism an awful lot, and so they had a problem with Jan, a European Protestant. Jan knew this, and he knew it because of persecution. But fortunately for Jan, he had heard of a town in western Germany called Munster. If you know history, that should ring a bell. Legend had it that Munster would be supportive, or at least tolerant, of Jan's radicalism, so he made haste, and they were indeed tolerant. But Jan must have been really excited because he overthrew that city within months by converting many of its inhabitants, driving out those who wouldn't convert, and he also replaced the city council with his converts. But anything that might not appear too serious ends there. Because he actually believed, for example, that Munster would be the New Jerusalem, and not only that, but he also ordered all women to be married, which led to polygamy. He would murder citizens without trial, and he even decapitated one of his wives. Oh, and by the way, not everyone there was tolerant. In fact, by now, Jan's New Jerusalem, quote-unquote, was surrounded by forces from Franz von Waldeck, the local Catholic bishop. And after that happened, the forces imprisoned the radicals, and there was the end of much discord. But no, actually, it gets worse because these radicals were gouged in the heart publicly, and before they died, their flesh was ripped off with searing tongs. So, theological debate looked a little different back then, don't you think? But do you know that the most prominent difference between the Anabaptists and Catholics is their view on baptism? That's what divides them. Baptism was such an extreme matter to these people that they killed each other over it. And I'm not here to tell you that that was a good thing. It was not a good thing. In fact, it was a very bad thing. But imagine if they would have used all that zeal to study and then discuss, or imagine if they had used their heads to reason and proselytize instead of committing homicide. I don't advocate for absolute unity without truth. That's not what I'm saying. But that's where fighting gets you. It gets you torture and it gets you homicide. So we should talk about this issue. So let's clear some cloudiness out of the way before we really begin. First of all, I'm going to be making a series of videos on Acts 2 and 3 and water baptism, and probably later some later chapters in the book of Acts. But first, there are some other points of contention that need to be addressed beforehand. Today we'll look at Acts 2:21, and it reads, "And it shall be that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." Second, let's lay out the basic context real quick. So in Acts 2, before verse 21, a bunch of people were gathered in Jerusalem, including the apostles, and then the Holy Spirit fell on them, and they started speaking in tongues, which means they were speaking languages that they didn't previously know. And everybody was amazed, and they were like, wow. And so Peter took that opportunity and he started preaching a sermon, and he started with saying, well, this is a fulfillment of a prophecy in Joel 2. So that's the basic context. And next, third, for some reason people have begun to think that one of the verses in Acts 2 says, be baptized and you will be saved, or something along those lines. And just to be clear, none of the verses directly say that. But anyway, let me start with this statement. Christians need saving every single day, all of the time. Now, before one side calls me a new heretic and the other side calls me a new convert, let me explain what I mean. In Matthew 14, Peter began to drown in the ocean and he said, Lord, save me. In Matthew 27, Jesus was on the cross and he was told, save yourself. In Mark 5, a woman touched Jesus' cloak and she was saved from her physical illness. As Christians, we must be saved from sinfulness every day as we live our lives and grow in discipleship. Saved from physical death, and the list goes on and on. So Christians do have to be saved all the time every day, but we don't have to be saved from hell all the time every day. But there is one Greek word for save and salvation in the Bible. There are two Greek words for save and salvation, but one for each, one for the verb and one for the noun. Sōzō is the verb and soteria is the noun. When the prophet Joel wrote, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, the Greek word in the Septuagint is sōzō. The idea, I submit, that sōzō is being used to refer to salvation from hell in Joel 2 is wrong. So think about the following sentence. She forced her friend to put his foot in hot water and it really hurt. How terrible, right? Why would anybody do that to a friend? Well, that friend would actually be one of the best friends because in that scenario, the woman's friend was stung by a stingray, and hot water actually neutralizes the pain caused by a stingray injection. So you see, if we don't know the context of something, we misunderstand it, or even worse, it has no meaning at all. You may have heard that context is critical when we interpret the Bible, and yes, that's true, but it's not a magic rule that only applies to the Bible. We don't say that context is key for no reason, basically. The reason that context is crucial is that the meaning of language itself relies on context. If we could isolate any one of our thoughts and forget everything else, it would have absolutely no meaning. And that's because every statement's meaning is known by a near infinite amount of logical connections in your head, and that's the context. And have you ever gotten bored and asked yourself a question, and then after you answer it, you ask yourself like the same question, and you keep doing that over and over and over again until you give up, or you get even more bored and go do something else? Well, I have, and it might just be me being weird, but anyway, you do that because almost everything that you know depends on something else that you know. So when we want to know what salvation means in Joel 2, we must know what its meaning is built upon, that is, the context. For those of you who like acronyms, as I do, we can use the acronym LED to remember the context of the word sōzō in Joel 2. We have the literal context, that's the L, the words that precede and precede verse 2, literal context, and then next we have the etymological context, which I know it's a fancy word, but it's just how the word salvation is used in other places in the Bible. Pretty much, the word etymological has a broader meaning, but that's how I'm using it. And lastly, we must remember the doctrinal context. That's D, the last letter of LED. So how do we use these forms of context to argue when we're addressing different people? Well, that depends on who we're talking to. The doctrinal context, for example, won't matter much to an amillennialist since they don't believe in the tribulation, and we're going to get into why that's the context soon. But the good thing is, the literal context is the strongest line of evidence, and it's always foremost when we interpret the Bible. The great thing about this type of context, and it's the first one we're going to start with, is that you don't have to know a lot, you just read the verses around the one that you're studying. So do we have any indications that Joel is talking about salvation from hell in the context, the literal context? No, we don't have any indications anywhere. So how about in chapter 2 and 3? Nope. How about in the entire book of Joel? Nope. So then, what is Joel about? Well, Joel starts with the sinfulness of Israel, its desolation, its strife, its wars, things like that, and it ends with Israel's holiness, its fruitfulness, and its peace. So that is the book of Joel in a nutshell, but it's only 3 chapters long, so you can prove that to yourself by going and reading it. So what kind of salvation is Joel specifically talking about in chapter 232, though? Well, we can examine the near context, the verses that follow and precede verse 32 within a couple verses or just one verse, and we find that the near context around verse 32 is discussing a war that will take place and those who would escape and survive that war. So what's the salvation here? Well, it's, as Joel says, escaping and surviving. It's salvation from physical death. Now, what if someone says, well, I don't know about that because normally salvation is about going to heaven. Is that true? Well, in the Old Testament, that is exactly the opposite of true. There are 2 main words for save and salvation in the Greek Old Testament, as I said, and those are sozo and soteria. Sōzō is used 287 times in the Old Testament, and only one verse might use sozo to refer to salvation from hell. And that verse is Job 33:28. And if you think that there are any others like it, then you can put them in the comments and we can discuss them. Next, soteria is used 107 times in the Old Testament, 0 of which refer to salvation from hell. Does this surprise you? Well, even if salvation is used in the Old Testament to mean salvation from hell occasionally, Catholic apologists, for example, will still affirm that this almost never happens. So that's coming from the Catholic apologists, but I would even say that there's only like one verse that could possibly be using one of these salvation words to refer to salvation from hell. And this is not something like Protestant propaganda because, Catholic apologists will make a similar claim. So if we were to assume what sōzō means here, we'd actually be better off assuming that it doesn't refer to salvation from hell. That is the etymological context, guys. So what if Peter was using this Old Testament passage in a mystical way with a new application? Maybe he was using the word sōzō in a new way in Acts 2, right? Well, no, that's wrong. And this point might be valid if Peter quoted Joel 2:32 in isolation, but because he includes the context, it shows that he is using the context to make his point. Therefore, verse 32 in Joel 2 cannot be disconnected from its context. When people are plagued by the cataclysms that precede and follow verse 32 in Joel, they will need somebody to save them out of those distresses. And that is what salvation is about in Joel 2. So now we know the literal and etymological context of salvation in Joel 2, so let's zoom out a bit, get a bird's eye view, and talk about the larger doctrinal and biblical context of Joel 2. So how does Joel 2 fit into the story of the Bible? Well, I'll break it down for you into 3 points you need to remember, with one passage for each point so that you can remember it better. We're just going to focus on the day of the Lord and what happens after it, alright? So we have to remember the what, the when, and the how. Remember those, what, when, and how. The passages that relate to this are Malachi 4, Matthew 24, and Matthew 23. If you'd like to remember these passages better, then remember 3 M's and 4:24:23. But you have to give it some kind of melody because it helps you remember things, or some kind of rhythm. So you could say something like MMM 4:24:23. All right. I just embarrassed myself for your memory, so try to use it, okay? The M stand for Matthew and Malachi, and then the 4, 24, 23 represents the chapters. Anyway, to know what the day of the Lord is, we need to know Malachi 4. When we read that very short chapter, we discover that the day of the Lord is a future global pouring out of God's wrath, which righteous people will not suffer. They will suffer, actually, but they won't suffer the wrath of God. They'll suffer the wrath of man. This period is called the tribulation. And we know that this event is in the future because verse 5 of that chapter says Elijah the prophet will come back to earth before this time, and he hasn't done that yet. So anyway, that's the what. That defines what the day of the Lord is. So when does the day of the Lord end? When does this tribulation thing end? It ends when Jesus comes back to earth. And so let's read Matthew 24, remember, M24, verses 29a and 30a. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Okay, we got that. This period will end after Jesus comes back. Next, and this is the most important, we need to know how this period comes to an end. Well, Matthew 23 gives us an answer. Speaking to Jerusalem, Jesus said, "For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Hey, that sounds familiar to me. Does it sound familiar to you? Because it should. That's what Joel referred to when he said, "Whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." So what happens is there's this event called the tribulation inside the day of the Lord, and when Jesus comes back, it's going to end the event. But before that happens, before Jesus saves people from the tribulation, they have to call on his name. So now we know how Joel 2 fits into the biblical story, and we know that calling on the name of the Lord results in Jesus returning to earth and saving the righteous physically who call on him from inside the tribulation. So there you have it, the 3 LED reasons why salvation in Joel 2 is not salvation from hell. But then, why was Peter using a passage about the tribulation when the tribulation still hasn't happened? Well, there are 2 perfectly good ways to explain this difficulty. And so Peter began his quotation with this, "And it shall be in the last days." These words are very important because according to Hebrews 1:2, Peter was in the last days, and so are we. So basically, Joel 2 began in Peter's days. It actually began before, and it's going to culminate in the future sometime. It still hasn't finished its fulfillment. The other answer is that Peter was hoping that the Jews would call upon Jesus at that point so that he would return to earth then. The fact that Peter thought this might happen is actually stated explicitly in Acts 3:20, where Peter says, basically, if you repent and all that, then the Lord will send times of refreshing and he'll actually return. And so if they did call upon the Lord, tribulation would still have to happen at that time, and Joel 2 would have been fulfilled then, at that time. So therefore, Peter quoted Joel 2, a tribulation passage, because he expected that it might be fulfilled during that time, or he realized that its fulfillment was beginning then and it will end later. So let's review quickly. Acts 2:21 is not an evangelistic verse because the word sōzō tells us that it is referring to physical deliverance. We know this because of the LED context, all right? I gave another little mnemonic for the doctrinal context, MMM 4:24:23. That's what I embarrassed myself over. And so Acts 2:21 is not about going to heaven. That's not what salvation means there. So we should stop using it that way. But we still have some verses to tackle, so give me a week or so and I'll discuss verse 38 next, the baptism verse. But in the meantime, leave any comments you have. I'll definitely respond because nobody leaves comments right now. I don't know why. It's kind of sad. But please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you all later.